At the company couple's dinner, I was speechless when I saw my wife's lover sit at her table and kiss her in front of everyone. It wasn't the kiss itself that destroyed what I felt, but the way she reacted, as if it were normal, as if I'd never existed, as if I were no longer her husband. And maybe I wasn't. There, in that moment when everyone around continued laughing, eating, and pretending not to see what they saw, I understood something that tore me apart silently. I had been replaced for a long time. Not cruelly and suddenly, but cowardly, gradually, as if I were being erased little by little, without even noticing. And the cruelest thing, she didn't seem to care anymore either. In the midst of it all, the waiter asked me if I wanted wine or water, and inside I was already completely drowning. After that night, I drove home in silence, my heart aching, trying to find a reason to keep pretending there was still something between us. But nothing made sense anymore. It wasn't just the kiss anymore. It was the time she spent looking at her phone and smiling from the corner of her eye. The dinners I cooked for two and ate alone. The repeated apologies, the distant looks, the absence disguised as fatigue. I just didn't want to see it. And maybe that's why it hurts so much, because, deep down, I already knew. And yet, I loved. I loved like someone who refuses to abandon a sinking ship, like someone who would rather die together than admit they were alone all along. When she got home that night, she walked in without guilt. She acted normal. As if nothing had happened. As if that kiss, that touch, that look shared with another man in front of everyone was no big deal. And me? I just stared at her for a few seconds, long enough for her to feel the weight of my silence, and then I went upstairs. I didn't yell. I didn't break anything. I didn't demand an explanation. I just breathed. And I wrote. On plain paper, with any pen, I wrote the only thing left to say, everything she needed to know, everything that killed me in life, everything that still held me there. And when morning came, I left the letter on the bedside table. I left the key in the kitchen. And I left behind the one thing I never imagined I would have to leave, the love of my life. She only realized I was gone when she woke up and saw the bed empty. And more than empty, cold. Because what was missing wasn't just my body. That's all I was to her. It was the care, the details, the presence, the comfortable silence of the mornings, the loving touch upon waking. And then she read the letter. I did read it. She told me so later. She read it and cried. But when did she cry? When did you realize I knew? When did you understand it was all over? Or when did you realize you lost me without having fought to keep me? I don't know. All I know is that after I read it, she tried to call me. Many times. But I didn't answer. Because sometimes the only way to maintain what little dignity you have left is to not allow your heart to try again where it's already been hurt so badly. Over time, I learned from friends that she began to wither inside. First came the attempts to reach me. Then the empty messages of pride. Then the silence. But not the silence of someone moving on, but the silence of someone who knows they've done everything wrong and have nothing more to say. And while she crumbled into silence, I learned to live with her absence. I learned to get used to the bed being bigger than necessary, to the music without dancing, to the coffee for just one. I relearned to breathe. To be self-sufficient. To remember who I was before I lost myself trying to please someone who no longer saw me. Months later, she found me. In a bookstore. She was different. Thinner. Sadder. Carrying a bag and guilt in her eyes. She tried to smile. She tried to say something. And I just asked, why? She didn't answer. Because she had no answer. Not the kind that changes anything. You just apologized. And then you broke down. You told me her lover was no longer with her. That he walked away as soon as everything came to light. That it wasn't love, it was vanity. That she'd traded her entire life for a fantasy. That she missed me. My gestures. My words. My way of loving. That she never understood what it was like to have everything until she realized she had nothing left. It was at that moment that I realized she was in pain. Real pain. Not for being caught. But for waking up too late. For losing someone who only wanted to make her happy. For betraying not only me, but herself. And there, with her eyes full, she asked me if she could ever have me back. If we could ever try again. And it was the hardest question I'd ever heard in my life. Because a part of me still loved her. But another, had already learned to move on. I forgave her. Because forgiveness is a freedom we give ourselves. But I didn't go back. Because love, no matter how deep, sometimes can't withstand the absence of care. Today we are two strangers sharing an interrupted story. A chapter that ended before the full stop. And sometimes we talk, with respect, with affection. But without that spark. She saw me love again. She saw me smile for someone else. She saw me move on. And that's where true karma lies. Not in the pain of abandonment. But in the clarity that what she lost cannot be rebuilt with belated regret. You can't recover what was trampled on, ignored, betrayed. And she knows this. And yet, she carries my letter in her purse to this day. She folds it carefully. She keeps it safe like someone protecting a memory of a time when everything could still be saved. But if I told you that, even after everything, there's still something between us, would you believe it? Maybe a silent bond that neither time, nor mistakes, nor others have been able to erase. Maybe a strange friendship, made of shared memories and pain. Or maybe just a goodbye that was never said quite right. What if I told you that she found something, among the things I left behind, that changed everything? That turned guilt into longing, and longing into a new kind of love, the kind that knows it can no longer be lived, but still insists on existing. Because before I left more than a letter. I left something she only found much later. And when she did, she realized everything could have been different. And that's when, everything changed. Welcome to the channel. Here, no form of betrayal is romanticized or encouraged. All stories are fictional, but they portray with intensity and realism the devastating consequences of bad choices. The objective is clear, to show that betrayal destroys homes, feelings, and lives. Get ready. What you're about to hear isn't just a story, it's a reality check. Enjoy listening. His name was Daniel, and he was the kind of man you wouldn't notice at first glance. Not because he lacked presence, but because he carried a serenity rare these days. His gestures were firm and gentle, and his manner of speaking exuded confidence even when the subject matter was volatile. He wasn't given to grandiose expositions, but he had a voice that knew how to be heard when needed. He'd worked in financial administration for years, in a position of trust he'd earned through consistency rather than ambition. And perhaps it was this same consistency that made him, in the eyes of many, an ideal husband. Discreet, committed, stable. But there was more to it. Daniel was a man in love. And not just in love with the woman he shared his days with, but with the idea of building a life with her, of growing old with someone, of having a home as a refuge, not just an address. Her name, on the other hand, was Laura. She was charismatic, sweet, and intelligent, with a look that easily caught your attention. She had an almost natural ability to adapt to different environments, converse with anyone, and effortlessly win people over. She had worked for years in events and corporate organization, which perfectly matched her vibrant personality. Laura was detail-oriented, passionate about beauty and aesthetics, from home decor to the gifts she chose. She had a habit of jotting down ideas in colorful notebooks and had a strong emotional memory. She could remember dates, flavors, and expressions spoken at specific moments. She was sensitive, but also practical. And perhaps that's why it was easy for her to take control of many of the couple's decisions without it feeling like a burden. For Daniel, that was comfort. For her, it was just routine. The two met at a corporate event. He was there out of obligation, representing the finance department of the company where he worked. She was responsible for organizing the space, the presentations, and the details. Their eyes met at the event's second breakfast, and something naturally sparked. There was no games, no strategies. Just easy conversation, sincere laughter, and a connection that grew over the following days. They began hanging out frequently, and less than a year later, they decided to share a roof. Marriage came naturally, unhurriedly, but surely. And for a while, everything seemed to fall into place. The apartment they chose together was bright, spacious, decorated with both touches, Daniel's neutral, minimalist tones and Laura's romantic, welcoming details. There was no exaggeration, just a harmony built gradually. Their routine was like that of many modern couples. They woke up early, shared the bathroom between toothbrushes and sleepy glances, had coffee with short conversations, and went about their days. Daniel had a firm habit of returning home at the same time. He was a man of habit. Laura, working in events, dealt with varying schedules, late-night calls, short trips, and unexpected demands. This was never a problem, at least not in the early years. They had a common understanding, trust above all else. And, indeed, trust did exist. Laura admired him. Not only for her beauty, but for her personality. Daniel used to say she was his organized chaos. And she, in turn, said he was her safe haven. Friends praised their balance, and family saw in them a stable couple who always knew how to reinvent themselves in the face of difficulties. But relationships aren't just about appearances. Over time, small silences grew longer. They weren't arguments. They were gaps. The hustle and bustle of everyday life, the cell phones on the table, Laura's increasingly frequent commitments, and Daniel's constant fatigue created spaces between them. Nothing serious. Nothing urgent. Just imperceptible gaps that, like a crack in concrete, seemed insignificant until they became visible. He began to notice that some questions no longer came. That the details of his routine no longer mattered. That her eyes, once so attentive, now passed over him like someone looking over a shelf. But he said nothing. Because love, for him, was also about giving time. And because he didn't want to be the man who suffocated the woman he loved. On the other side, Laura felt something she couldn't name. It wasn't a lack of love. But it was as if life had changed its tone. As if what had once been excitement was now merely stability. She began to feel irritated by his little habits, the methodical way he organized his books, his almost inflexible punctuality, his lack of spontaneity. And at the same time, I felt guilty for feeling that way. Because, after all, Daniel hadn't changed. She was the one who no longer recognized herself in the same way around him. And that, for someone as sensitive as her, hurt. She was afraid of settling. Of letting life pass her by without experiencing everything she imagined. But she also knew she was lucky. That she had someone by her side who respected her, who cared. And so she silenced her anxieties. She did what she did best, she disguised herself, smiled, maintained her lightness. The weekend plans continued. Dinners with friends, family lunches, series that began together and which she always finished alone because he slept on the couch. None of this was unusual. But something there no longer vibrated as before. And when they looked at each other, sometimes, they seemed like two acquaintances with a shared emotional memory, trying to remember what made them fall in love. There was still affection. There was still respect. But the desire, the admiration, the curiosity, these seemed to fade. And yet, they persisted. Because true love is not abandoned by any storm. At least, that's what Daniel believed with all his might. Laura, perhaps she was trying to believe it too. It was on one of those ordinary days, between a rainy afternoon and a grocery list, that Daniel had an idea. He wanted to surprise her. Lately, he'd noticed her lost gaze. The distractions. Her lingering absence. So he decided to prepare something simple but symbolic. He cooked her favorite dish, played the music they'd listened to at the beginning of their relationship, lit some candles, wrote a short note with a memorable memory, and waited for her. Laura arrived late. She said she'd had one more meeting. She was visibly tired. And although she smiled at the surprise, there was something about it that hurt. It was grateful, but not emotional. It was the smile of someone who recognizes the effort, but can no longer be touched by it. Still, they had dinner together. They talked a little. She complimented the seasoning. He joked about the improvised dessert. They laughed. They looked at each other. And for a brief second, it seemed like everything was falling into place. Until her phone vibrated. And she hurriedly looked away. She said she needed to answer something quickly. He said nothing. He just watched. He tried not to feel anything. He tried not to make assumptions. Because he knew that when love begins to suspect, it's a sign that something is already missing. But he swallowed hard. Like someone chewing bitter news. That night, they slept side by side. Back to back. And neither of them realized that that gesture would be the first of many to come. Time continued to pass, and life continued its seemingly normal course. But a weariness was growing inside him. A weariness that didn't come from work, or from routine, but from her absence, even when she was near. He began to notice her silences. The clothes she used to wear just for him, and now only when she went out alone. The new perfumes. The laughter that returned home without explanation. He didn't say anything. Not yet. Because he hoped it was just a phase. A turbulent period, like so many others. That soon she would look at him the same way again. That she would lay her head on his chest again and tell him that this was her favorite place in the world. Laura, for her part, struggled internally with a turmoil she couldn't control. There was a confusion between what she felt, what she wanted, and what she knew was right. Sometimes she cried alone. Other times she looked at Daniel and felt guilty. Because she still loved him, yes. But she no longer knew how to love him the way he deserved. She tried to convince herself it was just a phase. That everything would return. That it was the weight of routine, of demands, of expectations. But there was something inside her that insisted on leaving. And that scared her. Because she never wanted to hurt him. Never wanted to give up their story. But she also didn't know how to keep lying to herself. And then came the couple's dinner. An event like so many others. But with one difference that would change everything. And it was there, that night, amidst the glasses, laughter, and exchanged glances, that everything began to fall apart. But what exactly happened that night? And is true love really capable of surviving the silence of indifference? Or are some losses only revealed when it's too late? The light morning rain seemed to foretell what neither of them dared say aloud. The day of the company's annual dinner had arrived, and as usual, invitations had been delivered to the couples of the longest-serving employees. It was an elegant event, with a private room, low lighting, subtle decor, and a celebratory atmosphere. Daniel received the invitation as usual, with a certain polite indifference, but insisted on attending, as he always did with everything involving the two of them. Laura, on the other hand, showed enthusiasm. She chose her dress in advance, exchanged messages with some colleagues, booked a salon appointment to get her hair done, and insisted on buying a new pair of shoes, claiming she wanted to feel beautiful that night. Daniel watched everything with a discreet smile, but there was a growing uneasiness within him. He didn't know the exact reason, but there was something different in the air. Not exactly bad. Just different. During the drive to the event hall, the silence between them was heavier than usual. She stared out the window, distracted, while he kept his hands firmly on the steering wheel. They arrived on time. The place was filled with smiling couples, glasses of wine being poured, colleagues exchanging forced compliments and formal greetings. Their assigned table was centrally located, with a good view of the entire hall. Daniel helped Laura remove her coat, adjusted her chair, sat next to her, and tried to strike up a conversation with some colleagues he hadn't seen in months. She was radiant. She smiled easily, gestured, and greeted one after another with warm hugs. At times, he watched her and wondered where the woman who, days before, had been crying hidden in the apartment's bathroom was. It was as if she had cast aside all her anxieties and assumed a role that didn't suit the woman who shared his life with him. Dinner went on as usual for a while. Amidst laughter, bottles being opened, and memories of past meetings, Daniel tried to stay present. But something was increasingly bothering him. Laura's phone vibrated frequently. And although she tried to hide it, her attention was constantly diverted to the screen, as if waiting for something. A message. A confirmation. A sign. Until, at a certain point, she got up to go to the bathroom. A few minutes passed. Many. Daniel glanced discreetly at the women's restroom door and then at his watch. Just as he was thinking about getting up to look for her, he saw she was returning. But she wasn't alone. Beside her walked a man. Tall, elegant, with a confident posture and a subtle smile on his lips. Daniel frowned slightly, trying to place the face. It wasn't someone he knew directly. Perhaps from another department, or an outside guest. Laura held a glass of wine in her hand and chatted with the man as if he were someone close. She laughed softly, lightly touching his arm as she spoke, and her eyes seemed to shine brighter than usual. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. When they both reached the table, she introduced the man quickly, using a name that sounded too generic. She said he was a friend of a colleague, that he was just passing through, and that he would join them for a few minutes. The space next to her, which should have been reserved for Daniel, was taken without hesitation by the newcomer. And she, without ceremony, resumed talking to him as if they were resuming an old conversation. Daniel tried to remain calm. He observed every gesture. Every exchange of glances. He tried to ignore the uneasiness burning in his stomach. But there was something in her posture, something in her smiles, her touches, her two quick glances, that screamed inside. And then, what should have been just an impression became a certainty. The man, without any shame, leaned toward her, whispered something in her ear, and Laura responded with a restrained smile. It was at that moment that he moved closer. And kissed her. Not a long kiss. Not a disguised kiss. But a kiss long enough for everyone around to see. And she didn't pull away. On the contrary. She remained there, as if this were normal, as if nothing were wrong, as if Daniel wasn't sitting right next to her, his heart being crushed without anyone noticing. The world around him continued to spin. The music continued. The conversations continued. But for Daniel, everything had stopped. He stood still. Expressionless. Unresponsive. Just watching the scene that, however impossible it seemed, was unfolding before him. He felt his hands tremble. His chest tighten. His throat dry. And an absolute emptiness took over everything. What he had been feeling for months, that feeling of being slowly erased, now had form, a face, a name. It was concrete. Palpable. Too painful to bear. Laura, noticing his gaze, seemed to hesitate for a second. But she didn't say anything. You didn't apologize. You didn't try to explain. You just looked away and went back to talking to the man, as if nothing had happened. Daniel stood up, said the first apology that came to mind, and left the room with firm steps, but trembling inside. The night air felt suffocating. Shame, shock, and pain mixed in an unbearable whirlwind. He got in the car and drove in silence, his face wet not from the rain, but from the tears he couldn't hold back. And as the city lights blurred past the glass, he thought about everything he'd experienced with her, every gesture, every word, every promise made under the same roof that now seemed strange, cold, and false. Arriving home, Daniel didn't turn on the lights. He took off his shoes, sat on the edge of the bed, and stayed there for hours. He remembered the birthdays he'd prepared so carefully. The Sundays he'd cooked for pleasure, just to see her smile. The conversations about children, about travel, about growing old together. And now, it all seemed like a poorly staged play, a silent theater where he was the only one unfamiliar with the script. He grabbed a pen and paper. And wrote. Not with anger. Not with irony. But with the sincere pain of someone who gave their all and was still left behind. His words, short and direct, said the essential, that he knew. That he saw. That he understood what had happened. But that, above all, he needed to leave to protect himself. He left the letter on the nightstand. He took off his wedding ring. And left it there too. The next morning, before the sun had even fully risen, he left. He took with him a small suitcase, documents, and enough so he wouldn't need to return. He left no trace. He didn't reply to messages. He didn't answer calls. And the moment the door closed behind him, he took not only his clothes. He also took everything he was inside that house. His absence was immediate. She woke to find the bed empty, the silence heavy, and, beside it, the folded letter with her name handwritten on it. As she read it, there was no denial. Only tears. Many. Because there, in every line, she felt not the rage of a betrayed man, but the pain of someone discarded by the one they trusted most. There was no offense. There was only the naked pain of someone who has loved two for too long. But what she didn't know yet, was that among the things Daniel had left behind, there was something she would only find later. Something that would reveal an even deeper truth. Something that would completely change the way she viewed everything she'd ever done. And when that moment came, there would be no going back. Laura spent days trying to understand how everything had fallen apart so silently. His absence was a constant echo in every room, every corner of the house. His belongings were gone, but the smell remained, a cruel reminder of what she had let slip away. The letter she had read and reread was already crumpled, marked by tears and guilt. She knew she had done wrong, but she didn't realize how much she had lost until she felt, for the first time, that he might never look at her the same way again. She called. She texted. She even went to his old job, but discovered he had quit just a few days after dinner. He had disappeared without warning, without further explanation, like someone who realized there was no longer room for them there. Time, once the companion of apologies, became the enemy of reparations. And it was one night, while reorganizing the room, that Laura found the box. It was hidden at the back of the closet, behind a stack of books he usually kept in a specific order. The box was dark wood, small but heavy. Opening it, she found several old photos, movie tickets, folded notes with romantic phrases she herself had forgotten she'd ever written. There was a silver bracelet with a leaf-shaped pendant, the same one he'd given her on their first wedding anniversary. And at the bottom of the box, a manila envelope, with his unmistakable handwriting. It was different from the farewell letter. The paper was older, the writing firmer. She hesitated for several long seconds before opening it. Her heart raced as if something warned her that what lay within would change everything she thought she knew. When she finally tore open the seal, she found an undated letter, clearly written long before their separation. The first line was a punch to the chest. If you're reading this, it's because everything I feared has come true. From that point on, reading became a breathless dive. Daniel wrote about the night he discovered Laura had begun to pull away, not just out of boredom, but because of someone else. He said he'd sensed it long before dinner, that he'd noticed it in her gestures, her averted glances, her lack of interest, her excuses she found convincing. He said that, even though he suspected, he chose to remain silent, that he'd rather be deceived than lose the love of his life. But what made that letter different was what came next. Daniel reported that he had secretly purchased a new apartment. A space designed exclusively for them to start over. He detailed how much he had quietly saved for years, hiding his plan, waiting for the right moment to surprise her. He wanted to hand it over to her like a gift, with the key in her hand and the smile of someone who still believed in rebuilding. He wrote about the real estate agent who helped him find the property, about the afternoons he spent browsing furniture and curtains, dreaming of her expression when she first entered this home designed just for the two of them. He said he had imagined every room, that he had chosen a space with large windows because he knew how much she loved the morning light. He wrote about the office he had designed for her, about the terrace where he planned to plant lavender, as she so often spoke of on the nights they dreamed of the future together. At the end of the letter, he confessed that, after the kiss he'd witnessed, he'd returned home determined to give her that gift, not as reconciliation, but as farewell. He lacked the courage. He'd given up at the last minute, put the key in the box, and locked it. He preferred she never know. But now, with the letter in her hands, she knew. And she also knew that, by betraying him, she'd killed his dream of a new life with her before he could even be born. Laura fell to the floor with the letter between her fingers, unable to contain her tears, which were no longer just regret, but a grief that hurt more than any physical pain. She felt as if she'd burned, with her own hands, the last shred of pure love that still existed between them. Days later, driven by a mixture of desperation and hope, Laura managed to find the address of the new apartment. Not through friends, but with the help of one of the real estate agents he had mentioned in the letter. When she arrived, she knocked on the door as if weighed down by 1,000 apologies. Daniel took a while to open the door. He was different. His hair was a little longer, his eyes calmer, but there was still something of him there. The same look she had chosen not to see for so long. She apologized. Truly. Without embellishment. She told him she'd found the letter, that she knew about the apartment, that she now understood the depth of the pain she'd caused. She said she hadn't expected anything, that she didn't deserve forgiveness, but that she needed, at least once, to look him in the eye and tell him she regretted not only the betrayal, but everything she'd failed to see, appreciate, and care for. Daniel listened in silence. He didn't interrupt. He just watched. And when she finished, he responded calmly but firmly. He said he no longer felt anger, that he didn't hate her, that he understood that life changes people and that sometimes even those we love can be lost. He said he forgave her, yes. Because he needed to let go of the hurt. But there was no going back. That the love he felt for her, though real, no longer existed in the same way. Laura cried. She tried to tell him she still loved him, that she had hope. But he only held her hand for a few seconds, then let go. He said she would always have a place in his memory, but that now he was moving in another direction. And in that silence between them, with the rain beginning to fall outside, she understood the true weight of her choices. It wasn't just losing someone. It was knowing he loved her enough to start over with her. And she, through selfishness or distraction, destroyed that before she even realized what was happening. On her way out, she saw the apartment's floor plan hanging on the living room wall. Small, framed. Beside it, an old photograph of the two of them, taken in a park, when they still dreamed together. It was as if Daniel had decided to preserve the memory, not out of nostalgia, but as a testament to what had once been real. And there, amid memories that no longer belonged to her, Laura understood that some losses are permanent. Not for lack of love, but because love, when mistreated enough, learns to let go. But even after all this, destiny still had one more reunion in store. And this time, it would be different. Weeks passed since their reunion. Laura, despite her forgiveness, felt the ground crack every time she remembered his eyes, so kind and yet so distant. Daniel no longer showed any hurt, but the absence of affection was more cutting than any anger could be. His new apartment was too quiet, simply decorated, as if he were still in transition between the past and a future that had not yet been shaped. She didn't try to force another visit. She knew any insistence would be disrespectful. But she couldn't go on. The world around her continued to spin, commitments returned, invitations to events began to appear again, and the faces that had once filled her life all seemed absent. Her lover. He had disappeared as easily as he had appeared. A quick, shallow cycle, whose name was now unworthy of mention. When she sought support, she found indifference. When she tried to reclaim what remained of her social life, she realized she had lost more than one love, she had lost the way others saw her. She was no longer admired, no longer the center of attention, she was just another woman who made the wrong choice. Daniel, on the other hand, was slowly trying to rebuild a routine that made sense. There was no rush. The mornings were silent, the coffee always bitter, but time was no longer about absence, but about peace. He began frequenting new places, not out of escape, but out of curiosity. A photography course on Saturdays, walks in different parks, chance encounters with people he knew by sight and who now became companions. It was on one of these afternoons that he met Clara. She was different. She had a calm presence, a light laugh, and spoke little but precisely. She didn't ask too many questions, she didn't pressure. She was always there, discreetly but meaningfully. The connection wasn't immediate, and perhaps that's why it was genuine. There was no rush between them. Just a comfortable companionship that, little by little, became a mutual need. Laura learned about Clara through a mutual acquaintance. At first, she ignored him. Then, she feigned indifference. But all it took was seeing a photo of the two of them, posted by a friend at an informal dinner, for her world to fall apart again. The image was simple, the two of them sitting side by side, smiling subtly, but with a visible peace. Nothing forced. Nothing rehearsed. Laura spent hours looking at that photo, trying to find a trace of pain in his gaze. She found none. He was fine. Truly fine. Not the formal, fine, she practiced on social media, but a real, constructed, calm, fine. And it was this realization that truly hurt. Because, deep down, she harbored a silent hope that he would still look back. Days later, she ran into him again, this time by chance. She was leaving a bookstore when she saw him across the street. He was walking with Clara, carrying 2 coffees and saying something that made her laugh. Laura hesitated, considered crossing, but stopped. They didn't see her. She just stood there, on the other side, watching. For a moment, she wished she hadn't betrayed him. But soon she understood that the mistake wasn't the betrayal itself. It was everything she'd failed to do before it. It was not looking at him while there was still time. Not appreciating his silent effort, his daily love, his attempt to keep alive a flame she herself extinguished every day. She went home and cried, but not like before. Now, she cried with the acceptance of someone who understood that you can't force anyone to stay where they've been hurt. A few weeks later, an unexpected call came. It was Daniel. His voice was still calm, but there was something about it Laura hadn't heard in a long time, naturalness. He asked if she could meet him at the park where they used to walk. It wasn't a romantic invitation, nor a sign of reconciliation. It was something more than that. On the appointed day, she arrived early. She sat on the wooden bench beside the lake and watched the leaves fall. When he appeared, he was wearing a light jacket and carrying an envelope. He sat beside her without much ceremony. The initial silence was comfortable, but heavy with memories. He began speaking directly. He said he'd found an old letter from her, one of those written in colorful notebooks, full of plans and promises. And that, upon rereading it, he felt, for the first time in a long time, a calm affection. No pain, no pressure. Just memory. She listened in silence, her heart racing, trying to understand where this conversation was going. Daniel then handed her the envelope. Inside was a photo of the two of them, still dating, sitting in a field of flowers. On the back was a handwritten phrase, "Thank you for everything you were. Even when you stopped being." Laura read it and felt her eyes well up. He explained that he hadn't called her there to relive what they'd been through, but to conclude what needed to be concluded. He said there was nothing trapped inside him anymore, and that this reunion was a gift she might not understand now, but would understand later. It was the last time they would speak of that past. From there, they could move on, as they wished. Laura then made the only remaining request, that she not be a stranger to him. She wanted to be able to, at least, be someone he greeted tenderly, remembered fondly, and not completely erased from his life. Daniel smiled, for the first time in that conversation. He said she would never be forgotten, but that she now belonged to a time long gone. And yes, they could continue as friends, not because he wanted to maintain ties, but because forgiving was also liberating. She nodded. They stood there for long minutes, side by side, gazing at the lake as they had before, but now without promises, without demands, without expectations. That afternoon, Laura didn't cry. Because, finally, she understood. There was nothing left to recover. But there was much to learn. When they stood and said goodbye, there was no hug. Just a firm, respectful look. And a discreet smile, as if understanding that some endings aren't tragedies, but necessary closures so life can move on. Daniel returned to his new routine, to the peace he'd built, and to the love that now awaited him with maturity and reciprocity. Laura, in turn, returned home certain that she had lost something she might never find again. And this awareness, more than any judgment, would be the true mirror she would carry from that moment on. But even with the pain, the guilt, and the absence, something inside her was reorganizing itself. Not with the hope of return, but with the determination of someone who finally decided to face the consequences of what they had done and transform the pain into a lesson. Because there are things that, once broken, can't be put back together. But they can still teach us how to take better care of ourselves next time. And when Laura saw Daniel in the distance, weeks later, walking with Clara and a child in his arms, his new partner's daughter, laughing as he threw her high in the air and caught her safely back, she smiled silently. And understood, definitively, that some stories aren't about happy endings. They're about liberation. And about those who had the courage to move on. Laura began to live between echoes of the past and the silence of the present. The conversation in the park had left no hope, but neither had it left hatred, and perhaps that was the hardest part to digest. If Daniel hated her, perhaps she could still occupy a living space in his feelings, even if negative. But no. He had found something crueler for those left behind, peace. A pure, genuine peace that no longer needed her to exist. And now, no matter how much the pain consumed her at unexpected moments, there was nothing left to contest, nowhere left to run, no one to fight. Forgiveness had been granted, and with it came the silent sentence of a definitive end. The kind of end that doesn't close with screams, but with a firm gaze and a goodbye sustained only by absence. In the days that followed, Laura realized how accustomed she was to living by reflex. For years, she had shaped her routine around external validation, image, and a sense of control. The betrayal wasn't born of malice, but of unresolved dissatisfaction, of escaping from herself. The biggest mistake wasn't desiring someone else, but giving up on looking at the person beside her and everything they did in silence. Now, alone, she relearned to listen to her own footsteps on the cold living room floor, to make her own coffee without waiting for a kind comment, to make her bed knowing no one else would sleep there. She was forced to confront the woman she had become and, more than that, to understand how she had allowed her former lightness to turn into constant exhaustion. There were no more excuses, and there was no support either. Even her friends' perspectives changed. Everyone knew. Everyone saw what happened, even if in fragments, even if only between the lines. It was impossible to hide such a fall, especially when the other side of the story was moving forward with such dignity. Daniel, for his part, wasn't celebrating anything. The new beginning was real, but it wasn't easy. It was built with effort. Loving again was, above all, an exercise in faith. Trusting Clara required cautious surrender, constant self-observation. The old pain still lingered in some gestures, and occasionally, he woke in the middle of the night, unsure whether he dreamed of the past or the future. But each day, he allowed himself more. Clara didn't pressure him. She understood his silences, respected the days he preferred to remain silent, and celebrated the moments he smiled sincerely. They were building something based on the choice to stay, not the need to fill voids. And that made everything different. Clara's daughter, a 6-year-old girl named Sophia, became a bridge between two worlds. She didn't call him Dad, nor did she need to. But the way she threw herself into his arms when she saw him arriving, or the way she pulled him by the hand to show him her drawings, created a connection no biological bond could explain. For the first time, Daniel felt he could belong again without the past needing to be forgotten or erased. It was a new kind of love. More peaceful, more mature. And also more demanding. Because now he knew the price of ignoring signs, of leaving things unsaid, of pretending everything was fine while falling apart inside. So he made a point of communicating clearly, of showing himself whole, even while he was still rebuilding himself. Meanwhile, Laura began seeing a therapist. It was the only decision she made without considering others. She felt she needed to understand why she had allowed everything to go wrong. During the sessions, she realized that for a long time, she had lived to be desired and admired, but she didn't know how to sustain lasting love. Passion moved her, but stability bored her. And this imbalance always led her to destroy what was most solid. The relationship with Daniel was the first in which she was truly loved completely, without games, without artifice. And realizing this too late, everything turned to guilt and emptiness. The therapist said that blaming herself was the first stage, but that it would only be valuable if she transformed it into learning. The challenge now was to reclaim herself, not through regret, but through dignity. Over time, Laura began to walk around the city again without fear of encountering familiar faces. She began walking alone, going into cafes she'd once frequented with him, rereading books that had been lost in the chaos. She no longer sought excuses for what she'd done, but she also no longer wanted to be defined solely by that mistake. It still hurt. It always would. But she wanted to try to become a person who, in the future, would be able to love without fear, without running away. She wasn't ready yet. And maybe she wouldn't be for a long time. But she kept going. Step by step. With the honest slowness of someone who's seen the worst of themselves and decided not to stay there. Daniel and Clara, for their part, were planning a trip. A short trip, with Sophia, to a simple place. Something he'd never done before, lightly, without obligations. It was symbolic. It was a fresh start. They didn't need much. Just the certainty that they were choosing each other every day, without guarantees, but with truth. One afternoon before the trip, Daniel was walking with Sophia through the park and spotted Laura from afar. She was sitting alone, with a book on her lap, her eyes fixed on the trees. She didn't see him. And he didn't approach. He just stood there for a few seconds, watching. And in that moment, he didn't feel sadness. He felt respect. For the history they'd lived. For the pain they'd faced. For the paths they'd followed. That night, when he returned home, he told Clara he had seen Laura. She simply listened. She didn't ask what he felt. She didn't question him. She simply looked at him and said, "You're here." And he replied, "I am." That was it. He was there. Present. Completely. No longer divided between what was and what could have been. Laura, unaware of this brief encounter, felt something strange that afternoon. A shiver, a sudden memory, a longing that no longer came with pain, but with a kind of silent gratitude. She picked up her phone and wrote a message she wouldn't send. She simply wrote, "Thank you for loving me even when I didn't know how to love." She saved it to her drafts and closed the screen. That was it. It was enough. They were both different now. More aware, more mature, more attentive. But with irreversibly different paths. And in accepting this, they found true peace. Because some losses teach more than any permanence. And sometimes, love doesn't end, it just transforms, withdraws, and forces us to grow. The action had already ended. But what came next still carried the power to change everything. And this time, forever. On a humid spring afternoon, the air was thick and silent, as if the city, too, was trying to digest some absence. Daniel walked hand in hand with Sophia, and the child's tranquility contrasted with his own inner turmoil, a growing awareness that peace wasn't synonymous with oblivion, but with a deep understanding of what was worth keeping and what inevitably needed to be left behind. Clara waited for them at a bookstall, choosing something light for the weekend trip. Daniel watched her from afar, unnoticed, and in that moment, she had the distinct feeling that she was finally exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because everything was resolved, but because she had decided to stop feeding ghosts. When she looked up and smiled, it was as if the world had started turning right again. That night, while Clara put Sophia to bed, Daniel made 2 cups of tea. They sat together on the porch, as they had been doing for the past few weeks, and he decided to share something he'd been keeping inside. He said he was thinking about writing. Not exactly a book, but something between a chronicle and a diary. Not to publish, but to understand. He wanted to organize everything he'd experienced, not as revenge or exposure, but as a record. Clara listened without interrupting, and then said, with the simplicity that always enveloped her, that she thought it was necessary. That writing was a way of not letting the pain dissolve into oblivion, but of transforming it into language. Daniel smiled, as if given permission to give voice to what still throbs. In Laura's apartment, the nights were longer. The sounds of the city, which had previously served as a distraction, now seemed to amplify the inner silence. During her sessions with the therapist, she had begun to express a new desire: she wanted to rediscover meaning. Not in the past, but in herself. He began to take an interest in activities he would never have considered before. He enrolled in a ceramics class, not out of talent, but because he enjoyed the sensation of touching the material with his hands. There, between clay and silence, he discovered a new way to listen to his own thoughts. One day, while molding an abstract piece, he realized he no longer felt shame. He felt sadness, yes. But there was something else, a desire to rebuild himself. The pain no longer screamed. It simply accompanied him. One Thursday afternoon, Laura decided to visit an old mutual friend, someone who knew both her and Daniel, someone who hadn't taken sides but who had respectfully kept their distance after the breakup. The conversation was light at first, full of superficial updates, but gradually delved into deeper topics. She asked if he still saw Daniel often. The friend hesitated, then said yes. He commented that he was fine, that Clara was an incredible woman, and that Sophia had changed the way Daniel saw the world. Laura smiled, not ironically, but with that twinge of melancholy that arises when you hear that someone has moved on and become better without your presence. The friend then added, almost unassumingly, "He speaks of you with respect." I've never heard a criticism. Those words hit hard. Because she expected judgment, she expected resentment, and deep down she wished something was still simmering. But no. The past was now remembered with composure. And that, in a way, was harder to accept. That night, Daniel found an envelope in his mailbox. No sender, no warning. Upon opening it, he found a handwritten letter. He recognized the handwriting immediately. It was from Laura. The letter asked for nothing. It simply spoke. She said she didn't want to be remembered as the woman who destroyed a home, but as someone who failed, yes, but who learned. That she carried her mistakes not as a burden of self-punishment, but as part of an identity that now needed to be rebuilt. She thanked him for his forgiveness and said she was trying to become someone who, if she crossed paths with him in the future, could look him in the eye without fear, only with gratitude. Daniel read the letter slowly. He felt no anger. No longing. He felt only humanity. Carefully folding the paper, he tucked it away among the things he had decided to keep as part of his history. He didn't reply. He didn't need to. That letter didn't ask for anything in return. It was an honest farewell, and therefore, complete. The following Saturday, Clara, Daniel, and Sophia set off for a small town surrounded by hills and tall trees. Time there seemed to flow differently, as if the urban world had been paused. Mornings began with fresh bread and freshly squeezed juice, days passed with light hikes and spontaneous conversations, and nights ended with stories invented by Sophia, who liked to include everyone in her narratives, creating worlds where everyone lived happily together. On one of these nights, Clara asked Daniel if he thought it was possible for love to begin again after so many shattered moments. He looked at her sincerely, thought for a few seconds, and replied that perhaps love never begins again, it just transforms. That sometimes, what we call a second chance is actually something completely new, built on the ruins of what we once were. She simply nodded, holding his hand under the table. Meanwhile, Laura continued her process. She decided to accept an invitation to speak at an event on communication and reputation, an area she had neglected since her separation. She went with trepidation. She was afraid of judgment, of sidelong glances, of the past being whispered about in the hallways. But something surprising happened. She was respected. Applauded. And at the end of the presentation, a young woman approached her to say she admired the way she spoke, not for her eloquence, but for her courage to be real. That was more valuable than any award. It was recognition not of an image, but of a process. For the first time, she felt she could build something new with dignity. Something that didn't require erasing what had been, but rather integrating, learning, and moving forward. Days after the trip, Daniel was organizing a drawer when he found one of Clara's old photos, a picture of Sophia playing with paint, her hands stained, her smile wide. Beside it, another image, him, Clara, and the girl, together. Three faces that, even without blood ties, now formed the portrait of a home. He took the frame, hung it in the living room, and, for a moment, allowed himself to close his eyes. Not to erase memories, but to give thanks. The road to this point had been long. He had crossed pain, disillusionment, and darkness. But now, there was space. There was light. And in another part of the city, Laura was writing. Not a letter, not a request. Just thoughts. She was beginning to plan an exhibition of her ceramic pieces, blending art and words, feeling and form. She knew there would still be difficult days, that life doesn't always repay everything with immediate justice, but she also knew she was no longer trapped in the version of herself that destroyed what she loved. She was rebuilding. And that was real. And when the sky changed hue that afternoon, with a sunset that tinted the buildings orange and gold, something aligned. It wasn't redemption. It was responsibility. It was the recognition that, even when we make mistakes, it's possible to move on. But not without bearing the consequences. Not without looking at what was broken. And above all, not without understanding that love, when true, doesn't scream when it leaves. It simply withdraws. And when it leaves, it takes with it everything that once made sense. And it's in this emptiness that many finally learn to see themselves. And rebuild themselves. The last piece in the exhibition was finally in place. A raw, imperfect ceramic sculpture with obvious cracks along its sides. Laura chose not to hide them, instead, she applied gold paint to the fissures, highlighting the marks of what had broken and been rebuilt. The work drew attention for its raw strength, its lack of symmetry, and the contrast between fragility and strength. Beside the piece, a small plaque read, "Not all ruptures destroy. Some teach us to remain whole." She hadn't expected it to be understood, nor revered. But in that moment, she felt it had transformed into something more genuine. The exhibition was packed. People came, observed, and were moved. They didn't know the story behind those forms, but they sensed that there was pain and resilience there. And Laura, for the first time in a long time, didn't need to explain anything. The silence of the gazes was enough. At the back of the gallery, a familiar silhouette watched from a respectful distance. Daniel didn't approach immediately. He remained for a few minutes, absorbing the atmosphere, the meanings, the subtle gestures she let slip between conversations. When they finally met eyes, it was as if time were unhurried. She walked toward him calmly, holding a glass of water, and smiled. A smile that asked for nothing, sought no return. It simply acknowledged. He responded with a nod, and they remained side by side for a few seconds. Laura commented on the final piece, and Daniel said he understood her without needing to hear anything. She thanked him for coming, and before leaving, he said something she would never forget: "You're not the same anymore." And that is beautiful to see. There was no hug. There was no sentimental goodbye. Just a firm gaze, of two adults who had walked through an intense history, survived it, and, somehow, managed to emerge from it with more truth. Outside, Clara and Sophia were waiting for him. The girl ran up to him, handing him a small flower she'd picked along the way. Clara, with her usual serenity, simply watched, holding a paper bag containing 2 loaves of artisan bread and a discreet smile. Daniel hugged them tightly, saying nothing. There was no longer any division within him. This was home. This was the future. As they walked together to the car, he looked back for a moment. Not with longing, but with respect. Each step from then on would be toward something new, without the need to compare, without the temptation to mend what was broken, only with the certainty that loving again isn't forgetting, it's choosing differently. And he had chosen. In the following weeks, Laura was invited to teach a series of workshops on art and emotional process. Registration quickly sold out. People sought her not just as an artist, but as someone unafraid to show flaws, mistakes, and rebuild. Her words began to circulate in short videos, fragments of her lectures that touched people through their sincerity, not perfection. She spoke neither as a victim nor as a heroine. She spoke as a woman who had nearly lost herself by failing to take care of what mattered most. And who now refused to continue living on autopilot. The invitation to write a book came unexpectedly, through an independent publisher. Instead of refusing out of fear or shame, she accepted. Not to justify herself, but to document her journey. The title? After the Trail. Daniel, for his part, released his first collection of texts on affection and silence. Nothing commercial, nothing with any pretense of success. Just short essays on what it means to carry on after the end. Clara encouraged, Sophia colored the covers, and together they built a routine of small daily joys. For her birthday, he made the chocolate cake himself. A simple gesture, but it said it all. As he sang Happy Birthday, he looked at that table full of new people and realized that new beginnings don't have to be noisy. Sometimes, they happen in small pieces of peace. One night, as they were arranging the books on the new bookshelf, Clara asked him if he still missed what he'd experienced. Daniel took a while to answer. Not because he didn't know, but because he didn't want to misspell his words. Then he said, "I missed the version of myself that loved innocently. But I liked the man I became more after that." Clara leaned closer, gently touched his face, and replied, "I fell in love with that man. Exactly that one." And in that moment, amidst stacked books and suppressed laughter, what had once been pain transformed into maturity. The love there wasn't urgent, it was permanent. Laura continued writing. The book began to take shape during silent nights and cold coffees forgotten on the table. On one of the last pages, she wrote, "I lost the love of my life trying to find elsewhere what he already gave me. But life didn't punish me. It taught me." Upon rereading it, she cried. Not from the pain. But from the courage to finally look at the truth without running away. She no longer sought Daniel. She didn't try to reconnect. It was too late for that. But it wasn't too late to start over as a different woman. And that, in the end, was all she could hope for. And so the story came to an end. Not with the reunion of a broken couple, but with the individual evolution of two people who once loved each other deeply and, upon losing each other, were forced to grow. Betrayal, with all its emotional violence, did destroy. But what emerged from the rubble was stronger, more conscious, more true. And that is what remains. Love, when wounded, can even endure. But when betrayed, it falls silent. And this silence, for the one who caused it, is the cruelest of screams. Now I want to know, what did you think of this story? Did it touch you in any way? Leave a comment below with your opinion. And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, take advantage of this moment and subscribe now. Here, we tell real, intense stories, designed to move and make you reflect. No form of betrayal is supported on this channel. All stories are fictional, but based on real feelings and situations that clearly show how a wrong choice can destroy not only love, but also respect, trust, and an entire life built together. Let this story serve as a reminder: cheating isn't just any mistake. It's a choice. And choices have consequences. When you hurt someone you love, there's not always time to fix it. Think carefully before losing someone who never wanted to leave you.